How to not be a conspiracy theorist in 4 easy steps. How to not be a conspiracy theorist, aka extremist. By Vlad the Nazarite Gandhi. Conspiracy theories are more and more common these days as our society strays farther and farther from the truth, and the self-evidently right people who know what reality is are more and more detached from the squalid lives of average people who, in their completely unfounded mistrust, turn to these false and preposterous theories for meaning and comfort in a confusing and chaotic world. Here are a few easy tips to remember in order to avoid joining the ranks of these unfit, unwashed, degenerate persons whose presence will be increasingly unwelcome in polite society, if we have our way. 1. Make sure your mainstream anti-conspiracy reality filter is firmly in place. In order to not be a conspiracy theorist, it's important to ignore and discard all facts and evidence that suggest any sort of conspiracy could be taking place. Conventional wisdom, inarguably the best kind of wisdom, holds that conspiracies don't ever happen in real life and are self-evidently false and ridiculous. The very fact that the word conspiracy exists in law proves that conspiracies don't exist in the real world, and that everyone who thinks this is the case is a nut job who sees sinister plots in even the most mundane and ordinary everyday events such as random acts by lone nuts which alter the course of history.
Commission report.
And by definition, there had to be a conspiracy.
22 years later, Stone is still convinced he's right.
Governments lie. And everything we've learned since 1991 when the film came out has reinforced the notion that the governments have not been straight with us.
Do you see conspiracies in everything?
Conspiracies, like unicorns, elves, fairies, goblins, and Sasquatches, are nothing but the aberrant products of the overactive imaginations of deranged individuals with regressive, Neanderthal-like tendencies. Any evidence which purports to suggest one could be occurring is therefore irrelevant and can and should be safely filtered out as unimportant. Luckily, most information is pre-filtered before the fact by the trusted, authoritative, corporate news sources and massive, tech behemoths, so that evidence suggesting cover-ups or highly improbable coincidences is already removed or algorithmically suppressed for you, as a free service. Which brings us to our next tip. 2. Limit or narrow your dataset based on the currently accepted narrative. When trying to come to an understanding of what's happening in the world, the most dangerous thing you can do is to do your own research, also known as reading, and come to your own conclusions, also known as thinking. Because, as an ordinary, average person, you lack the proper training and aren't intelligent enough to evaluate and perceive reality for yourself. It's really best to avoid going down rabbit holes if at all possible, and it is far, far better and safer to place blind trust in authoritative channels of information, all of which are run by properly trained and compromisable professionals who are experts on absolutely everything and thus infinitely more qualified than you to evaluate what is true and what is false.
For that information, do feel free to visit at any time to clarify any rumor you may hear. covid19.govt.nz. Otherwise, dismiss anything else. We will continue to be your single source of truth.
But if you absolutely must research a contentious topic for yourself, it's of crucial importance to narrow your data set to only the information that supports whatever is the narrative du jour. That way you can rest assured you will be safeguarded from inadvertently being led away from the well-trodden path of acceptable opinion and radicalized from exposure to unauthorized alternative facts. Of course, please make sure your filter is intact and fully functioning before embarking on such a dangerous endeavor.
3. Ignore human history and recent history. And speaking of narrowing your dataset, the next topic which concerns us, and which poses a potential pitfall for anyone seeking to avoid being lumped in with the nutters, is history. This is a topic of crucial importance. Historical context, when not correctly interpreted by the proper authorities, can be incredibly perilous and lead one to the delusion of thinking that because in the past there have always been people who sought after power and domination over others and who were willing to commit many inconceivable atrocities in its pursuit while creating untold death, suffering and human misery, that this could still be the case today. The reality is that, with the exception of a growing number of backwards reprobates and tin pot dictators, we now live in a civilized and sanitized society, a global, new world order, if you will. The truth is that people with tens or hundreds of billions of dollars in their bank accounts and more yachts, mansions, fancy cars, and creepy private underage sex islands than they could ever enjoy in several lifetimes aren't really seeking more power and control to maintain this unprecedented inequality and prevent the masses from altering the carefully managed homeostasis of gross inequity. They aren't seeking to maintain the enormous power they have over society, nor are they willing to plunge countless people into unspeakable misery to obtain more. Neither are they invested to the hilt in a shared objective of solidifying their global hegemony and waging an all-out, no-holds-barred war on the global population in order to achieve their ends.
There's class warfare, alright, but it's my class, the rich class, that's making war, and we're winning. Warren Buffett, a
Quite the contrary, they are really just trying to give back through their philanthropic efforts, and any suggestion to the contrary could result in your being permanently exiled from or never considered for membership in the exalted Hall of Respectability, a kind of Valaya which is now peopled by only the most morally upright, uninterested parties, whose scrupulous members maintain our wonderful liberal society and which is not in any way owned by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or being blackmailed by shadowy intelligence assets like Jeffrey Epstein, whom we know was an anomaly and certainly the last of his kind.
Background.
Well, and, I've said I regretted having those dinners, and there's absolutely nothing new on that.
Is there a lesson for you, for anyone else looking at this?
Well, he's dead, so, in general, you always have to be careful.
So just as a rule of thumb, you can go ahead and ignore, discard any and all evidence of conditions or events which seem to echo or resemble horrible things from the past as having any relevance to current time, because we know none of that nasty stuff is happening anymore except for in isolated pockets in backwards nations, and even in those cases, the proper and right authorities are definitely selflessly addressing the situation and not attempting to maintain their non-existent empire or hegemonic rule over the world's affairs, as mentally unstable people, opportunistic grifters and members of Russian state-affiliated media often like to claim. Also, a note on recent history, there may be times where the narrative from the present completely contradicts one from the recent past, and often in multiple ways. Ignore this completely and carefully watch the proper authorities to ensure you are staying in lockstep and on message and not getting thrown off by the shifting sands and moving goalposts of the always correct narrative du jour, lest you end up like this whack job.
They call it a scenario. These are scenario narratives, and they speak about it in the past tense. So they put out this scenario, lockstep. A world of tighter, top-down government control and more authoritarian leadership with limited innovation and growing citizen pushback. Okay, I'll read a little bit of it. In 2012, the pandemic that the world had been anticipating for years, nobody was anticipating a pandemic, finally hit. Unlike 2009's H1N1, this new influenza strain originating from wild geese, they use some scenario, but this is Ebola they're talking about. Even the most pandemic-prepared nations were quickly overwhelmed when the virus streaked around the world, infecting nearly 20% of the global population and killing.
In fact, whether it's the recent or the remote past, the safest, most foolproof approach to staying on message, not running afoul of the predominant groupthink or stumbling from the one true faith of the narrative du jour, is to just memory hole anything before last week. But as long as you never trust your own intuition, pattern recognition or critical thinking to contextualize events, and rely exclusively on the proper channels to both interpret and rewrite history for you as necessary, you'll be safely ensconced within the official, socially acceptable consensus reality while still being able to sound intelligent and impress others at parties with your vast store of useless and trivial facts without ever making anyone feel momentarily uncomfortable or causing awkward pauses in the conversation.
4. Mock, dismiss and ridicule. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, in order to fully and completely differentiate yourself from the tinfoil hat, conspiratorial dregs of society, it is vital that you actively mock, dismiss and deride anyone who does believe in conspiracies. This one may sound easy and obvious, but it is actually a subtle art form. Firstly, it's often easy to identify conspiracy theorists because of their ridiculous, idiotic tendency to refer to a nebulous they equals the hierarchy enslaving you, whom they foolishly believe are controlling things and wielding hidden power and influence from behind the scenes. Or in some cases, fringe conspiracy lunatics will misconstrue overt agendas led by billionaires and elite class members as nefarious, when they are in fact 100% benign and benevolent. In this case, a really quick and efficient way to stop the conspiracy loon in his tracks and dispatch with his incessant, incoherent ravings is to ridicule the notion that there is any such they at all. Simply ask who the they is and watch their entire edifice crumble as they sputter out in complete frustrated inability to provide a succinct explanation of who they is and how they are planning it all. As everyone knows, wealthy oligarchs and their various servants in government, academia and the press don't have common interests and certainly don't work together. That is in concert, to advance them at the expense of others.
These capitalists generally act harmoniously and in concert to freeze the people. Abraham Lincoln.
Also remember that anyone who believes one conspiracy theory automatically believes every other conspiracy theory that exists, no matter how absurd, foolish or ridiculous. When dealing with someone who espouses conspiracy theories, regardless of how sensibly or reasonably they attempt to comport themselves, how rationally or logically they attempt to present their arguments and alternative facts, or how they adamantly insist that the term conspiracy theory was popularized by the CIA through their mockingbird agents in the media to discredit those who were questioning the Warren Commission report on the JFK assassination. You must never forget they are in reality a credulous, smooth-brained, unsophisticated rube who can be safely, smugly dismissed and compared to the most unhinged fringe weirdo in existence, and their arguments equated with the most far-out, fringe beliefs. For example, if someone mentions what they claim is a proven, false flag, you could simply bring up the flat earth theory or the fake moon landing theory or QAnon, and attribute this belief to them as well. If someone says they don't believe the official story of 9/11, you could ask them if they think the planes were holograms generated by lizard people and accuse them of anti-Semitism. If someone mentions they are concerned about experimental, emergency authorized medical products with no manufacturer liability, you might label them an anti-vaxxer, casually mention 5G did not cause the virus, or tell them how silly they are to think anyone like Bill Gates would want to implant them with microchips even if they said nothing at all about those things. Establishing whether or not the person espousing one outlandish fringe conspiracy actually believes in any of these other crackpot ideologies is immaterial, as all their beliefs can be assumed to be arbitrary and based on irrational pathology.
In essence, just take the most exaggerated, outrageous-sounding claim that leaps to mind and which you associate with whatever they're saying and reflexively, aggressively attempt to associate it with them. You can always call them a tinfoil hat and post an absurd gif of Alex Jones going bonkers, but there are many, many ways to go about this. Keep in mind that this isn't actually a cheap straw man attack. The thing to remember is that all beliefs that aren't part of the approved narrative of authoritative, corporate news sources are fringe beliefs, and all fringe beliefs are to be regarded as identical, lumped together as one thing, and discarded. They are never to be taken on a case-by-case basis or evaluated on their own merits. This is because there is no appreciable difference between any beliefs which are relegated to the fringe, and anyone who holds any non-mainstream and, rightfully, stigmatized belief isn't to be regarded as a rational, thinking individual with her own unique perspective arrived at through careful introspection, consideration of evidence and broad sets of data patiently gathered and painstakingly evaluated over time, but rather as someone with an unfortunate pathology that simply makes them susceptible to erroneous, non-evidence-based ideas about the world. They are all basically comparable to deranged nutbags like David Icke or toxic, bloviating windbags like Alex Jones. So you don't need to listen to them and can ridicule them accordingly using the stock thought-cancelling cliches, or if you like, get creative and invent your own not straw man insults which the trusted intelligence assets in the corporate media will relentlessly shove in your generously provide for you. If you take one thing away from this article, it should be this, that history has proven time and time again that nothing in reality can be held as true until such time as it is generally accepted as true, that societal norms are the best regulator of personal epistemology, and that those norms are never set by the most powerful and dominant members of a culture, the ruling class, but occur mostly organically, and if not, then it's probably for the best interest of all, and that because of this one needn't concern oneself with anything other than avoiding becoming a target of ridicule by staying well within the daily shrinking intellectual constraints and cognitive guardrails of acceptable opinion which are there for your safety, not imposed on you by the non-existent, they posited by those with an unfortunate excessive overabundance of belfry bats, along with their guano, which experts now say is the most likely source of the next pandemic, not lab leaks.
I hereby declare myself the center of all political opinion. Anyone who deviates too far from what I think about things will be designated an extremist and placed on a naughty list. Watch this space for details on the limits of acceptable thought. Nebulous P. McCrotty.
Fortunately, the trusted sources within the completely uncorruptible institution that is the corporate, billionaire-owned media are there to manage the narrative for us, which they all do independently in virtually identical ways, and often using virtually identical language to doggedly enforce the all-important boundaries on what facts can be permitted to enter the public discourse and what can therefore be accepted as true. Anyone who attempts to push against these boundaries in any way quite simply can't be taken as a rational actor, definitely cannot be trusted, and should be mercilessly ridiculed, pathologized, infantilized, criminalized, and probably locked away somewhere, in order to ensure social progress can be safeguarded by the most capable and benevolent hands of the non-existent technocratic overlords.
checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and
False news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these things simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think, and this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 The media is the most powerful entity on earth. They have the power to make the innocent guilty and to make the guilty innocent. And that's power. Because they control the minds of the masses. The press is so powerful in its image-making role. If you aren't careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing. Malcolm X.
If you can keep these 4 simple tips in mind, you should be extremely well protected and fully inoculated against the insidious influence of conspiracy theories and extreme ideologies. But in order to help you in this regard and to further assist you in ingraining these concepts and in programming yourself to reflexively reject any and all dangerous counter-narratives you may encounter in the wild, and in order to make 100% certain you are well armored and fully protected against all forms of fringe, conspiracy extremism, here is a simple easy to remember acronym. FLIM. Filter out, fringe, alternative facts purporting to support the existence of conspiracies, easily accomplished by consuming only pre-filtered corporately owned, authoritative media and in staying on the well-worn trail made by big tech algorithms. Limit your data within the acceptable range of reality, as defined by the narrative du jour. Ignore history. Stay completely ahistorical in your framing of events unless otherwise instructed by approved, authoritative sources who can interpret it correctly. Mock others who don't conform to these basic guidelines as credulous fools and loonies. Congratulations! If you've internalized the steps outlined above and incorporated them into your daily cognitive processes, you'll be well equipped to avoid ever being seen as a conspiracy theorist.
But finally, just to make it all concrete, I would like to leave you with one particularly tragic and disturbing example of a once respected academic and author who strayed from the narrow way of well-trodden, time-honored, acceptable opinion from the point of view of the non-existent tHeOrISt. Unmoored himself from the sublime, supine security of intellectual sycophancy and compulsive, obligatory narrative genuflecting, and wandered foolishly and heedlessly into the dark and murky morass of fringe conspiracism. Let his tragic story serve as an example and as a lesson to never, ever be like this man.
Speaking of propaganda, it is in your propaganda class that the thing happened that led to your lawsuit and all the groups.
Yes.
So you want to talk about it?
Well, I've been teaching at NYU since 1997, media studies. And one course that I teach often is a course on propaganda, which I don't approach as a kind of remote historical phenomenon, something that...
Or this man.
So you live in DC, right, Max?
Yeah, we got to get vaxxed.
Yeah, I got to get
do a live show.
Yeah, we got to get vax. I got to get a vax.
I got to get my vaccination comedy passport, and then eat a Bill Gates Impossible Burger on stage. It'll be the Great Reset comedy show.
Why do you call it a Bill Gates Impossible Burger?
Or this woman.
This is a time for a national dialogue to take a breath and be like, okay, maybe we're not going to know what to do for 5 minutes. Maybe we need to really speak with each other and problem solve and brainstorm. And everybody just wants to skip over this part. And that's what a lot of my videos have been. Let's talk, let's collaborate, let's stop looking for a hierarchical power structure to dictate us and understand how you take power as a people, because power is taken and not given. So how do we take power?
Or this man.
So Crispin Parenti is a full tenured professor of economics at John Jay College, City University of New York. His most recent and fifth book is called Radical Hamilton: Economic Lessons from a Misunderstood Founder. He has also recently published a very interesting article entitled How the Organized Left Got COVID Wrong, Learned to Love Lockdowns and Lost Its Mind, an Autopsy. And that's the main article that we're going to talk about. So Crispin, thank you again. And folks, please like.
Or this woman.
All over the world, people are rising against colonialism. People are pulling down Columbus's statues and other colonizer statues. It is time to realize that Gates is the new Columbus, and you want to truly decolonize, organize around Gates. We marched against Monsanto. We held public trials of Monsanto. Monsanto disappeared. It has been swallowed by Bayer, which is itself in a crisis. We must have marches against Bill Gates to basically show who is pulling strings, who's the elephant in the room. And as was said by Tim, we, of course, love our elephants, but this metaphor tells you that the secrecy, this corruption of media, the corruption of policy, the corruption of government, the suppression of tried, tested alternatives that work for the earth and people, and to impose systems that have proven to be destructive, proven to have failed. This is high-level dictatorship in every field of our life. And
or this man.
How can they ever be countenanced or challenge these kind of views in this kind of culture where this misinformation, disinformation, censorship mentality is increasingly taking hold?
The aim of these insults, anti-Semitism, conspiracy theorists, when they're false, some people are anti-Semitic and they deserve to be called anti-Semitic, but when these insults are used to undermine criticism of Israel or to destroy Jeremy Corbyn's working class movement, the aim of them is to make people beyond the pale, so that you can't even let them enter the arena of debate. You can't let Jeremy Corbyn and his supporters enter the arena of debate because you're already dismissing them as anti-Semites. And this is a major crisis that they have to address before they can even be in the arena. And the reason that has to happen is because the establishment actually can't counter Jeremy Corbyn's actual arguments and his real views and doesn't have a suitable alternative to them, because what Jeremy Corbyn stands for, I think, speaks to people. It speaks to people's material needs. And
this woman.
Well, you may have been thinking it, but not saying it out loud, and that is discussing the possibility that there has been parallels between public health measures for COVID-19 and how the Holocaust came to be. Don't shoot the messenger. I'm just Drea Humphrey, a journalist with Rebel News who brings you the other side of the story. And who better to interview to do just that than a Holocaust survivor who's dedicated her life's work to advocating for human rights. As interesting as this interview sounds, you're not going to be able to.
Big lesson that I learned was I was disobedient at one point where I wouldn't follow the dictate of authority. Mm-hmm. That incident saved my life. So I come to this situation that we're in, where we're being dictated to, everything from government dictates. I don't take well to that at all. And I wish that most people would stop obeying, because by being obedient, you are allowing the dictators to flourish.
Thank you for doing your part to keep the barbarians at bay and to help maintain this perfect, beautiful world order which is the best of all possible worlds and is most assuredly the world we all want. The end.